There was a little boy on his first airplane ride, and he said to his daddy after they went up, "Daddy, when do we start to get smaller?" And it's an interesting question. Since the airplane gets smaller, why don't the people inside get smaller? And this relates to Euclid. An enclosed space is visual, is static. It cannot change. Now, if there were no canopy on the airplane, if it were an open cockpit plane, the people in the plane get smaller as the plane goes up. Parachutists say that at the moment they jump out of the plane, they're about 1 inch high. But when you're in an enclosed space, you remain static. This is visual. This is a peculiar property of the visual space when isolated from the other senses, that it becomes static. Now, this refers to many of the characteristics we associate with civilization. The alphabet, in divorcing the heart, the right hemisphere, from the head, the left hemisphere, the quantifying, visual, detached, observant function, the alphabet in doing that left the other side of the brain somewhat in abeyance. The Greeks developed an environment of services and roads and military activities. Alexander the Great would have been quite unthinkable without the alphabet and without the lineality that went with it. And the Romans took over from there and developed an even more lineal and bureaucratically hierarchic structure. The courier systems and the military world of the Greeks and the Romans provided an environment which pushed the right-left hemisphere up into dominance, a dominance which it retained all through the Middle Ages and through the Renaissance, and reaching very high peaks with industrial assembly line and other structures of the lineal kind. Of course, at the speed of light, the environment that supported the left hemisphere suddenly is challenged. From the telegraph onward, the instantaneous character of the environment of information tends to push the right hemisphere up. A simultaneous environment, unheard of before electricity in the world, a simultaneous environment reactivates and gives dominance to the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is characterized by intuitive, holistic, or totalitarian, and simultaneous awareness. For example, you cannot recognize a human countenance with the left hemisphere. You have to use the right hemisphere, or the functions of the right hemisphere, to have pattern recognition of complex structures. Complex structures like the human face can only be recognized by the right hemisphere. There's the case of a recent case of a Chinese who was completely paralyzed on his left hemisphere by a stroke, which in no way affected his speech or writing in Chinese. Chinese writing and speech does not depend upon any lineality or sequentiality or any of the characteristics of the left hemisphere. The same is true to various degrees of most of the third world. The third world is a right hemisphere world. Now, these hemispheres are empirically established. They are not theoretical in the usual sense of the word. They are discovered by brain surgeons in the course of repairing brain damage. and they have gradually spotted these functions as a result of their being impaired or dysfunctional. Now, the two hemispheres relate to the right and left hand. Handedness relates to the hemispheres. The left hemisphere controls right hand, and typically, and the right hemisphere controls left hand, typically. But that doesn't mean that a left-handed person is minus any access to the left hemisphere, nor vice versa. The two hemispheres are related by a large nervous structure called the corpus callosum, which is on top of the brain. This is a kind of interchange area where it is possible for dialogue to go on between the two hemispheres, and they should be and tend to be in a state of dialogue with each other. It simply happens that in an extreme culture, like our first world, literate culture, based upon an extreme use of lineality and for quantifying and measuring and expanding services at a very high speed, that extreme use is what gives the chart its significance, because at the peak performance of the first world, industrially and so on, the right hemisphere has a very small function to perform. The left hemisphere tends to be in charge of education. All IQ testing is left hemisphere. Nobody has ever devised an IQ test for the right hemisphere. The very nature of IQ testing is quantified and therefore alien to the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is designated by quality and the left by quantity. The left hemisphere by eye, the right hemisphere by ear. The ear hears from all directions at once and therefore is simultaneous. The eye does not see from all directions at once. The ear creates a kind of acoustic space by the factor of simultaneity, and someone, I think it was Proclus, defined God as that being whose center is everywhere and whose margin is nowhere, which some psychologists designate as the nature of acoustic space. Acoustic space, that space in which the center is everywhere and the margin nowhere. It reminds me of a little item in Mr. Eliot's criticism, in which he is discussing the auditory imagination. It's in his essay on Matthew Arnold in the uses of poetry and criticism. What I call the auditory imagination is the feeling for syllable and rhythm, penetrating far below the conscious levels of thought and feeling, invigorating every word, sinking to the most primitive and forgotten, seeking the beginning and the end. It works through meanings, certainly not without meanings in the ordinary sense, and fuses the old and obliterated, the trite and the current, the new and the surprising, the most ancient and the most civilized mentality. A simultaneous structure, the auditory imagination. Eliot is famous also for his remark that all art from Homer to the present forms a simultaneous order, another acoustic image. All art from Homer to the present is simultaneous, it's all here, and the advent of any new kind of art modifies the entire structure. The same is true of any musical structure. The advent of any new note, any new phrase, any new rhythm modifies the entire structure. I think the same is true of all of our technology, since all of them are extensions of our own bodies, and therefore any innovation in technology modifies our relation to ourselves and to our bodies. This kind of homeostasis or equilibrium among the senses and among the technologies has led some people to entertain the idea of an ecology of media, a way of arranging the media so that they orchestrate instead of clashing with each other.